The smell of my uncle's cologne was the first thing I noticed when I walked into Grandpa's house that afternoon. Thick, expensive, the kind that announces itself before the man does. He was already seated at the head of the dining table. Grandpa's chair, like he'd been waiting for me to walk in just so I could see it. I was 29 years old, and I had driven 4 hours from Cincinnati to Millbrook, Indiana, for my grandfather's funeral. My hands were still shaky from crying on the highway. I hadn't eaten since the night before. "There she is," my uncle said, not standing up. He smiled at me the way you smile at someone you've already beaten. "Long drive?" I said yes. I set my bag down near the door. I looked around the house. I'd grown up visiting every summer. The same crocheted blanket on the couch, the same clock on the mantel, the same smell of cedar and old books. And I felt the floor shift underneath me in a way I couldn't explain yet. My grandfather, Walter Keene, had died 6 days earlier. A stroke, fast and quiet the way he'd always lived. He was 78. He had built Keene Agricultural Supply from nothing, starting in 1974 with a leased warehouse and a second-hand truck. By the time I was born, it was one of the largest independent farm supply distributors in southern Indiana. He had spent 40 years building something real. He had also apparently died without a will. That was what my uncle told me the morning after the funeral. His name is Boyd, my grandfather's only son, my father's older brother. He called me at 7 a.m., 3 days before I drove down. "I need you to know that Grandpa didn't leave a will," he said. "Which means the estate goes to next of kin. That's me and your father." I sat up in bed. "Okay," I said carefully. "And what about the business? The business is part of the estate." A pause. "I've already been in contact with a business attorney. My father, for context, is not involved in any of this. He and my uncle have barely spoken in 12 years, since a falling out over money I was never fully told about. My father works as an electrician in Columbus. He signed over his portion of any inheritance to Boyd 3 years ago in exchange for Boyd settling a debt. I only found out about that much later. So when Boyd said next of kin, what he meant was himself. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just anger. It was something colder, a kind of recognition. Like I had always known, somewhere, that it would end like this. I had worked for my grandfather, not symbolically, actually worked. From the time I was 24, after I finished my business degree at Indiana State, I had driven down to Millbrook every few months to help him modernize the company's inventory system. Then it became every month. Then I was working remotely for him full-time, doing accounts receivable, vendor negotiations, updating the software systems that hadn't been touched since 2003. I did that for 5 years. I took a salary well below market because it was his company, and I loved him, and I thought one day that would mean something. Boyd lived in Scottsdale. He visited for Christmas and called on birthdays. He had nothing to do with the business. When I arrived at the house that afternoon, 3 days before the estate attorney was scheduled to come, Boyd was already there with his wife and his son from his first marriage, a 22-year-old named Preston who wore a Patagonia vest and kept checking his phone. There was an energy in that house that I recognized from the few times I'd been around families dividing things up after a death. Territorial, careful, everyone watching, everyone else's hands. I hugged my aunt. I shook Preston's hand. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood there looking at the window above the sink, the one that faced the backyard where my grandfather had kept a garden, and I let myself feel it for 1 minute. The grief, the real grief, the kind that has nothing to do with money. And then I set the glass down and I went back into the dining room. "I'd like to be included in the meeting with the attorney," I said. Boyd looked up. "You're not a beneficiary, sweetheart. I've been managing the company's operations for 5 years. I think that gives me standing to be in the room." "It gives you an employment record," he said, "which I'll be happy to compensate you for. We can discuss severance." Severance? I had to press my thumbnail into my palm to keep my face still. That night, I slept in my grandfather's guest room, the same room I'd slept in every summer since I was 7. There was a framed photo on the dresser, me and Grandpa at a county fair. I was maybe 10 years old, holding a ribbon I'd won for something I can't remember now. He had one hand on my shoulder and he was looking at me, not at the camera. I stared at that photo for a long time before I turned out the light. The next morning I woke up early and went down to make coffee and found something on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there the night before. A small envelope, cream-colored, with my name written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Not my grandfather's. Neat, careful, older-looking somehow. I picked it up and turned it over. On the back, a name, Loretta Finch, attorney at law. I stood there in my socks in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. Then I opened it. The note inside was short. It said, "Your grandfather asked me to contact you directly if anything happened to him before we could meet. There are things you need to know. Please call me before Thursday. This is time sensitive." A phone number was written below. I looked at the date. It was Tuesday. I took the envelope upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and called the number. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was measured, professional, with a slight southern Indiana cadence that reminded me of my grandfather. "Miss Keene," she said. "Thank you for calling. I know this week has been difficult. Can you tell me what this is about?" I said. "How did you get into the house?" "Your grandfather gave me a key 6 months ago," she said, "along with instructions. He'd been planning to tell you himself. He'd been putting it off. I think because it was difficult for him to say out loud, but he wanted you to know before any legal proceedings moved forward." "Know what?" She paused. Not an evasive pause. More like the pause of someone choosing words very carefully. "Your grandfather did not die without a will," she said. "He had a valid will executed 14 months ago. Your Uncle Boyd was told there was no will because your grandfather chose not to disclose it to him. The will is real, it's filed, and it leaves the majority of the estate, including the business, to you." I had to sit down. I was already sitting. I put my hand flat on my knee to make sure it was still there. "Why?" was the first word I said. "He told me," she said slowly, "that you were the only one who showed up." His words. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was looking at the photo on the dresser again. Him with his hand on my shoulder, not looking at the camera. "There's something else," she said. "Something he wanted you to know separately, which is why he asked me to contact you in person rather than simply filed a will. It's about the company's ownership structure, specifically about a transaction your uncle made approximately 2 years ago." She explained it carefully. Boyd had approached my grandfather 26 months earlier claiming that the business needed outside investment. He had convinced my grandfather to sign a series of documents. My grandfather was in the early stages of the cognitive decline that his doctor had noted but not yet formally diagnosed, that transferred a 40% stake in Keene Agricultural Supply to a holding company. That holding company, she had discovered, was controlled by Boyd. My grandfather had not understood what he was signing. When he finally did understand, about 8 months later, he had gone quietly to Loretta Finch, who had been his personal attorney since the 1990s, and asked her to help him figure out what to do. He didn't want to confront Boyd directly, she said. He was afraid Boyd would accelerate whatever he was planning. So we spent the last several months building documentation, gathering records, making sure the will was airtight. "Is it?" I said. "Airtight? That's why I needed to reach you before Thursday," she said. "The will is filed and valid. But there is a legal process and Boyd will contest it. You need representation before that meeting happens." I went downstairs. Boyd was in the living room with Preston, both of them on their phones. His wife was somewhere in the back of the house. I walked past them into the kitchen, took the coffee off the burner, poured a cup, stood at the window. I want to be honest again. Part of me wanted to walk into that living room and say something. Part of me wanted to see his face. But the other part, the part that had been watching him for 5 years, the part that understood now why my grandfather's eyes had sometimes gone distant and careful when Boyd called, that part said, "Not yet." I drank my coffee. I went back upstairs. I called the attorney my grandfather's lawyer recommended. His name was Garrett, and he had handled estate litigation in Indiana for 20 years. I told him everything in 40 minutes. He was quiet for most of it, asking short clarifying questions. At the end he said, "Okay, don't sign anything. Don't engage with your uncle about the estate. And I need you to get me copies of whatever employment records you have, emails, contracts, anything that documents your role in the business." I had 5 years of emails and a filing cabinet worth of records on my laptop. I had brought my laptop because I had been in the middle of a vendor contract renewal when my grandfather died. I hadn't thought of it as evidence. I thought of it as work. The meeting with the estate attorney Boyd had hired was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. at the Millbrook offices of Keene Agricultural Supply. On Wednesday evening, Garrett drove down from Indianapolis and met with me at a diner outside of town. He had reviewed Loretta Finch's documentation. He had a letter prepared. "He's going to be surprised," Garrett said. "I know," I said. "How are you feeling?" I thought about that honestly. "Like, I've been waiting for something to land for a week," I said. And it finally did. Thursday morning I drove to the office. I had worked out of that building for 3 years. I knew every person there by name. When I walked in, the receptionist, a woman named Janet who had worked for my grandfather for 16 years, looked at me and then looked quickly away. And I could tell that Boyd had already been in and said something. Boyd was already in the conference room with his attorney, a guy in his 50s from Indianapolis, who had clearly been told this was a routine estate proceeding. Preston was there too, still in the Patagonia vest. I walked in with Garrett. Boyd looked at me. Then he looked at Garrett. Boyd looked at me. Then he looked at Garrett. Something shifted in his expression. Not worry exactly, but a recalibration. "What's this?" he said. Garrett set the letter on the table. "My client is a named beneficiary in a valid last will and testament executed by Walter Keene 14 months ago," he said. "The will is on file with the Bartholomew County Probate Court. We're here to ensure the estate is administered accordingly." Boyd's attorney picked up the letter. I watched Boyd's face. The thing I had expected, the anger, the denial, didn't come right away. What came first was a stillness, like a man who has been running a con long enough to know when it's over. "This is the first I'm hearing about any will," Boyd said. He was looking at me, not at Garrett. I didn't say anything. "There must be some mistake," he said. "Dad told me, Mr. Keene," Garrett said. "We're also prepared to address the unauthorized transfer of a 40% stake in Keene Agricultural Supply to Ridgeline Holdings LLC, executed approximately 26 months ago under circumstances our client intends to contest." Boyd's attorney put down the letter. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Boyd's attorney asked for a continuance to review the documentation. Garrett said that was fine. On the way out, Boyd touched my arm in the hallway. I stopped. "I don't know what you think you know," he said. His voice was very quiet. I looked at him. I thought about my grandfather, 26 months ago, sitting across a table from this man, not fully understanding what he was signing. I thought about Loretta Finch, spending months building a case quietly, alone, because an old man had asked her to. "I know that Grandpa trusted you," I said, "and I know what you did with that." I walked out to the parking lot. Garrett was waiting by his car. "Okay," he said, "it begins." What followed was not fast or clean. I want to be clear about that, because stories like this get told sometimes, like the hard part ends when the truth comes out, and that's not how it works. Boyd contested the will. His attorneys argued that my grandfather had not been of sound mind when it was executed. Loretta Finch had anticipated this. She had documentation from my grandfather's physician confirming his capacity at the time of signing. She had also had a cognitive assessment performed specifically in preparation for the will signing, which was, Garrett told me later, unusually thorough. "He was careful," Garrett said. "He was always careful," I said. The case took 11 months. I moved to Millbrook for that time. I ran the business, the real operations, the ones that kept the lights on, With the help of the staff who had been there for years and who, it became clear, had their own feelings about Boyd that they had never been in a position to express. Janet, the receptionist, brought me a folder the second week I was there. It contained printed emails. She had been keeping them for 8 months. I didn't know what else to do with them, she said. The emails were between Boyd and a contact at a competing distributorship. They discussed, in fairly specific terms, the plan to acquire the 40% stake through the holding company and then use it to push for a sale of the business. The language was not quite criminal, but it was close enough that Garrett forwarded them to a civil fraud specialist. The Ridgeline Holdings matter was ultimately settled. Boyd agreed to relinquish the 40% stake in exchange for the estate not pursuing further action. He did not admit wrongdoing. I did not require him to. What I required was the stake back, which is what we got. The probate court ruled in favor of the will in the spring. I was named sole heir to the business and the primary beneficiary of the estate, with smaller bequests to my father and to 2 of my grandfather's longtime employees. I called my father that evening. He had known about the will. Grandpa had told him, sworn him to silence, asked him to trust the process. My father had. He had not told me because he was afraid I would confront Boyd too soon. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," he said. "You trusted him," I said. "That was the right thing to do." There was a pause. "He really loved you, you know," my father said. "He told me once, he said you were the one who showed up when it mattered. He said he wanted you to have the chance to do what you were already doing." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I want to tell you what happened with Boyd. Honestly, because it would be easy to make this part simple, and it wasn't. He was my uncle. He is my uncle. He is my uncle. He is my grandfather's son. I believe that he told himself, over years, a version of the story where what he was doing was reasonable, where he was owed something, where the family business should have come to him, where I was an interloper. I don't think he thought of himself as a villain. People rarely do. I called him 3 weeks after the probate ruling. He didn't answer. I left a message. I told him that I wasn't interested in continuing any legal action, that the business matter had been resolved, and that I would like, at some point when he was ready, to talk. Not to litigate, to talk. He hasn't called back. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. I've made my peace with both. What I haven't made peace with, what I'm still working through, honestly, is the feeling that I should have known sooner, that I should have asked more questions, that there was something my grandfather was carrying alone for too long and I was too busy with invoices and inventory systems to see it. But then I think about Loretta Finch leaving that envelope on the kitchen counter before dawn, and I think about my grandfather giving her a key 6 months before he died, because he trusted her and he trusted the plan, and I think maybe he didn't need me to see it. Maybe he needed me to be exactly where I was, doing exactly what I was doing, so that when the time came, everything I'd built was already there. I run Keene Agricultural Supply now. I've been doing it for going on 2 years since the ruling. We have 31 employees. We renewed the vendor contract I was in the middle of when he died. Last fall, we expanded into a second warehouse in Terre Haute, something my grandfather had been planning for the last 5 years and never quite gotten to. I made a decision early on that I was going to keep the culture he built, which meant keeping the people he valued, which meant not making any of this feel like a hostile takeover of what had been a family company. Janet is still at the front desk. She got a raise and a title change she had deserved for a decade. I still have that photo on my dresser. Me and him at the county fair. His hand on my shoulder. Him not looking at the camera. I talk to him sometimes, when the office is quiet and the light comes in a certain way through the windows he picked out when he built that building in 1989. I tell him how the quarter went. I tell him what we're working on. I tell him I understand now why he did it the way he did it. Quiet, careful, documented, patient. I tell him I'm trying to do the same. I don't know if any of that reaches anywhere, but it feels true, and right now that's enough. I thought a lot about why my grandfather did it the way he did. He could have told me. He could have sat me down at the kitchen table over coffee and explained everything. The holding company, the documents Boyd had slipped in front of him, the plan he and Loretta had been quietly building for months. He didn't. And for a long time, I carried a small, private ache about that, like I had been kept on the outside of something that was entirely about me. But here's what I've come to understand. He wasn't keeping me in the dark. He was keeping me clean. If I had known, I would have done something. I would have confronted Boyd or said something careful at the wrong moment or let it show on my face at Christmas. And Boyd would have moved faster, covered his tracks better, and everything Loretta had spent months building would have collapsed. My grandfather understood people. He had spent 40 years running a business, which means he had spent 40 years reading rooms. He knew what I would do if I knew. So he protected the plan by protecting me from it. That's the thing about integrity that nobody really talks about. It's not just about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you build quietly over time when no one knows you're building anything at all. My grandfather had every reason to be bitter. His own son was stealing from him. He was in his 70s. His mind was starting to slip in small ways, and the person he had trusted most in his family was using that against him. He could have been angry and obvious about it. Instead, he got careful. He got documented. He got a lawyer and a plan and the cream-colored envelope with my name on the front. I think about Boyd sometimes too, and I try to be honest with myself about it. What he did was wrong, not complicated. Wrong, just wrong. He exploited a man who was losing his sharpness, a man who had given him every opportunity, a man who still called him on his birthday every year. And yet, I don't think Boyd woke up one day and decided to be a villain. I think he told himself a story over years where he was owed something, where the business should have come down the family line in a particular direction, where I was a complication, an outsider who had inserted herself. People are very good at building justifications that let them sleep at night. The problem is the justifications don't change what the actions actually were. What Loretta did, that quiet, careful, patient work, that was intelligence in the truest sense, not cleverness, not outsmarting someone, just the discipline to gather the right information in the right order, without tipping her hand. I've tried to carry that into how I run the business now. When something goes wrong, my first instinct used to be to react. Now I ask myself, what do I actually know? What do I need to find out? And what's the right sequence? That came from watching what she built. That came from my grandfather. The hardest part of this whole thing wasn't the 11 months of litigation. It was learning to sit with uncertainty while trusting that the right thing was already in motion. That takes more out of you than a fight does. A fight has an opponent and a clear direction. Waiting requires you to just keep showing up. Keep running the invoices, keep renewing the contracts, keep being exactly who you are, while everything else gets sorted out around you. That's what my grandfather asked of me without asking me. And somehow, without knowing it, I did it. I don't have a clean lesson to wrap around all of this. What I have is a warehouse in Terre Haute that we opened last fall, and 31 people who come to work every day at a company that's still standing, and a photo on my dresser of a man who believed I could handle the thing he was leaving behind. That's enough. Most days, that's more than enough.